My name is Mick Mulhern and I'm the Director of Planning and Transport at South Dublin County Council. Today is the first workshop that we're holding on our plans for the City Edge area. The City Edge area is 700 of hectares of land around the Naas Road, Ballymount areas of Dublin. It straddles across the boundaries of South Dublin County Council and Dublin City Council. And this work is a joint piece of work, collaboration between both councils to progress a master plan for this sizable part of the city. The website has a significant amount of information on where we are in the process and the information that you can look at and understand. And today we're going to take you through a short presentation on what's being proposed as part of this master plan. And at the end of that, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. The meeting will finish, or the workshop will finish at about 4:15, and I hope to be able to deal with all of the questions that we have. But if we don't, you can provide comments and questions, and you can provide responses to the public consultation via the website at cityedge.ie, and that will take you direct to South Dublin County Council's portal, so you can make submissions at that point. At this point, what we'll do is Brian Keeney, who is the Senior Planner in Dublin City Council, will take us through a presentation for about 20 minutes. And after that, we'll have an open Q&A session where we'll moderate questions and hopefully we'll be able to take people's questions as we go. In the background, we do have some members of the team as well who will be able to answer those questions. So at this point, I'll pass over to Brian Keeney and he'll take us through a presentation.
I'm Senior Planner with Dublin City Council, and I'm the project lead on the Dublin City side on this kind of collaborative project that we're doing with South Dublin County Council. So I have a presentation they're going to take you through now, about 20-25 minutes or so. So if you just pop up the presentation there, please, and we'll kick off. Okay, so just to start, I suppose there's two parts effectively to today's event. There's a presentation, and as Mick has alluded to, we'll be giving an opportunity for Q&A at the end here. And then obviously this is part of a 4-week consultation that we're doing on this particular project. So really, we'd like as much feedback as we could throughout the next couple of weeks. And again, as Mick has alluded to, we've got the cityedge.ie website. So again, please register there. Please leave your comments. So next slide, please. So just in terms of the presentation, split into 5 different parts, just to talk a little bit about the project and put it into a bit of context for people. And then I'll outline the work that we've completed to date, and I'm going to look at some key findings, our emerging objectives, which we've used to basically inform and prepare our land use planning and urban design placemaking study for the area, the various scenarios that we developed as part of our research to date, and before turning then to our emerging preferred scenario. And that's the important piece about today as well. That's really what, again, we're looking for your opinions and your engagement on. And within that, then I'll discuss the land use themes that underpin and support the scenario and the big moves. And we've identified 10 of these. And the big moves, I suppose, are shorthand for the infrastructure that's needed to support the urban regeneration of the area. And I'll touch a little bit on the program overview and next steps. And as I mentioned, or as Mick mentioned there at the start, we'll hopefully have an opportunity for very detailed Q&A after that. So next slide, please. So what is the project about? As you can see there in the slide in front of you there, it's 700 odd hectares of land. The orange line that you can see there it demarcates the boundary between Dublin City Council, the administrative boundary between Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council, and again underlines the fact that it's a joint project between ourselves, the two authorities. Just in terms of the geography of the area, and to put it in context, people will be familiar enough with the N7, and as you come kind of up, I suppose, the N7 from North Kildare, you obviously hit the Newlands Cross and the Red Cow roundabout, and that effectively forms the western boundary in the M50 of the study area. The eastern boundary is demarcated really, or joins Walkinstown, Drimna and Inchicore. To the south, we've got Temple Oak and Walkinstown as well, and to the north we've got obviously the Park West area that forms part of the study, and obviously Cherry Orchard as well. I suppose the real reason we're looking at this project and the work that's been done to date is, this whole issue, I suppose, in terms of planning policy that we have in Ireland at the moment. We have the National Planning Framework, which supports the whole concept of brownfield consolidation. And effectively, areas like this on the Naas Road have kind of been really kind of earmarked as a potential location for that. So really what we're saying here today is that if areas like this are going to be subject to significant urban regeneration, there's challenges associated with this. We want to build consensus around this if this is the right thing to do. And we want to identify the challenges and provide a roadmap for that change. So if we just move to the next slide, please. So in terms of the work to date, we've undertaken a baseline study, and we've looked at a number of areas. The first one I'm going to touch on here is employment. And in terms of our analysis and work to date, we've uncovered a number of interesting facts. The area is mainly industrial and commercial employment use, but it's important in terms of the city overall. There's obviously 25,000 jobs there. There's 1,500 businesses, and 4% of Dublin's employment base is actually located within those 700 odd hectares. And the area itself generates 1.98 billion annually in terms of the Irish economy. And there's key businesses located in there. There's the likes of Diageo, DHL, Earnode Éireann, An Post, and FBD Insurance, just to name a few. But there's a huge opportunity here too. Again, a lot of the land is the big boxes. There's a lot of underutilized land and opportunity there. And what we're really saying here, the proposition is that we could potentially deliver 75,000 jobs in this location in different sectors over time. So could just move to the next slide, please. And looking at the whole issue, I suppose, of homes and the existing residential population there's 5,000 people live within the study area within 1,500 homes. And again, I suppose, given the opportunity of the location of the area and its proximity to the city centre, there's a real opportunity here to deliver new homes. But again, it goes without saying, whatever is delivered here in terms of new homes or whatever has to integrate with the existing communities. Next slide, please. And in terms of the place itself, I suppose everybody in their mind's eye will have a view of what the Naas Road is. And it probably, I did refer to the employment piece there and the kind of like the big box nature of that, etc. But there are a number of hidden gems, if you like, located within the 700 odd hectares, and there's a few of them shown on the slide there. You've, obviously the Grand Canal, the Cammack River itself, although a lot of that is culverted, and you've obviously Drimna Castle. And I suppose the challenge again, I suppose, with the work we're doing here when we're developing our preferred scenarios, to build on these assets to create a place that's, obviously climate resilient and integrates existing and new communities. Just moving on to the next slide, please. So effectively, looking at that kind of analysis, we then have identified, if you like, a vision for the area, and that vision is to create a mixed-use area which is climate resilient, which is accessible in terms of transport, etc., which can deliver affordable homes and provide the opportunity to work locally. But we're kind of conscious of the fact that there's existing businesses in this area as well, so it's not just about providing new homes. We're really obviously keen that we retain and protect as many of the existing jobs there, and indeed that we expand on that offer. And then around that vision then, as part of our thinking, we've developed these 8 key objectives that you can see around livable city, economy, housing, environment, movement, character and urban design, sustainability, and deliverability and credibility. And they've provided, if you like, the key kind of drivers in terms of how we've shaped the preferred scenario. And they've kind of informed our thinking the whole way through. So just moved on to the next slide. So based upon our key findings, if you like, our baseline study, and working with our key objectives, we identified 3 scenarios for the area, and I'll just run through them quickly there, and you can kind of see them on the slide there in front of you. So just moving kind of from left to right. The first one is a major centred urban scale. So this is kind of a big bang solution where you would be looking at significant redevelopment within the area, identifying a new centre of significant scale located on the intersection of the Naas Road and the Carlmore Road, with an opportunity for creating high density employment. And also the opportunity to attract major institutional uses. The second or middle scenario there that we've identified is an enterprise and urban industry led mixed use option. And this is really kind of more of a surgical, I suppose, approach towards the regeneration of the area. It's looking at maybe key sites and locations where we could potentially identify locations for high-end manufacturing, and also within that, working very closely at retaining and promoting the existing employment, and then identifying smaller nodes with specializations for employment uses, and obviously supporting residential development as well. And then the last one is a residentially led mixed use, so you get predominantly more homes than jobs in the area, and this would look at more of a dispersed growth across the area, and obviously requiring significant amounts of supporting infrastructure. So next slide, please. So then just looking at our emerging preferred scenario. So this really effectively, as we kind of work through our analysis, if you like, and as we engage more with kind of key stakeholders, particularly in terms of infrastructure provision and public transport, etc., we kind of recalibrated our scenarios, and we kind of came up with a blend of scenarios, really, an option that kind of touches upon three main characteristics. I suppose a blend of scenario 1 and scenario 3, effectively. So what we're looking at here is a major centre for employment with an opportunity to deliver between 65 and 75,000 jobs. The focus on that intersection, if you like, of the N7 with the Kylemore Road, starting, if you like, approximately where the Royal Liver Business Park is, and extending northwards along the Kylemore Road up as far as the Cork railway line, and there's an opportunity there for a new heavy rail station at that location there. And again, our aim is to attract investment and generate significant amounts of employment. Within that, then, there's the opportunity for what we've identified as urban industry, and effectively there's an opportunity here to capitalize upon the strategic road network, and obviously the proximity to the M50 there, that creates certain environmental conditions which wouldn't be best suited to residential development. So what we're saying here is there is an opportunity here for the place to evolve, to deliver those particular types of uses. And there may be an opportunity within that to deliver what we've identified as meanwhile spaces, where to generate or to meet a demand for short-term or medium-term uses. And all the work that we've done to date on the economic front has been informed by an economic analysis. And then the last element, that is the residential. So we're looking at, again, 75 to 85,000 people there, with 4 interconnected hubs to deliver new communities with employment uses side by side, and obviously the necessary social amenity space and facilities to support that. So we've just moved on to the next slide, please. So spatially, I suppose, on this slide here, this is what you kind of end up with. And this is conceptual now. It's kind of fairly high level and strategic, but it kind of gives you a good indication of what we're talking about here. So effectively, we're looking at kind of six major kind of centres or hubs. The main hub, as I mentioned, is that kind of area in pink there on the slide, at the intersection of the N7 with the Kylemore Road. And we're looking in that centre of delivering somewhere in the region of 12,000 people and 20-odd thousand jobs. And that's surrounded by 5 smaller hubs. And I suppose as you move kind of east to west, it becomes more, you have more people located on the eastern side of that, more in those centres. And as you move west towards the M50, the conditions that I've mentioned there, we're saying that there should be a greater balance in terms of employment uses. And that effectively, I suppose, is the scenario and what we're discussing here today. But again, I just want to explain in the next section of the presentation here the thinking and the logic of how we got towards that. And there's a series of kind of land use themes that inform that. So if I just move to the next slide, please. And as I discuss the land use themes, I'll look at the context and the challenges associated with them. So obviously one of the things that we're very aware of, and I don't need to mention it, I suppose, to anybody attending today, there's a whole challenge around the delivery of housing in the Greater Dublin area. There's issues around affordability, and indeed there's questions about the role of the state. So obviously we want to align our approach in terms of the regeneration of the area to all of those. There's a real opportunity here, though, I suppose, to deliver housing at scale, given the extent of the land. We're looking at maybe higher density housing, family units, and a range of topologies to support that change. But again, one of the things that we're very keen to kind of deliver is the whole livability element of that. So it's not just about the housing and the numbers, it's about the different types of housing that's needed there, and also the requirement for a good social mix to create a balanced community. And then the other challenge, again, that's happening in the area is that the market isn't static, and there's about 3,500 units with planning permission in the area, mainly centred on that intersection between the the Naas Road and the Kylemore Road in the Dublin City Council area, where we've got a local area plan. So again, the challenge is how do we calibrate the plan and the delivery of those units within the context of the wider residential offer for the area. But you can see in terms of headline figures, we're looking at 75 to 80,000 people living in the area and delivering a series of centres where you're looking, at a range of population between 4 and 8,000 per neighbourhood. So just move on to the next slide there. So just looking at the whole issue of employment. So again, there's a big issue here about, I suppose, attracting and accommodating growth into the area. And not only that, but also getting a good cross-section in terms of employment use. I mentioned the fact that you have existing businesses there and we want to retain them. And if there's a requirement for relocation, we want to get a handle on how that, when and how that might happen. We're also aware of the 4 Seveso sites in there and the challenges associated with developing those locations or adjacent to them. And again, the City Edge project, as we've named it, has to play its part, both in terms of the metropolitan context and nationally as well. So what is the employment offer for this area, and what is the character of that going to be, and how is that going to fit, I say, within that metropolitan and national context? And then effectively, what we're saying is that we're targeting that major urban centre there at that intersection of the N7 Naas Road with Kylemore. We're looking at potentially 20,000 jobs there. And then across the area, that the 65 to 75,000 jobs. I mentioned our economic study, so we're very much having an eye to the future and the changing nature of employment and the land use and floor space requirements around that. So in the short term, we've identified opportunities around construction, logistics and e-gaming. In the medium term, opportunities around financial technology, greener energy and technology, and indeed medical tech, and in the longer term options and opportunities around aviation and biopharmacy. Just moving on to the next slide, please. So looking at I suppose the theme of natural infrastructure, I mean, there's a series of kind of challenges again in this area. We have the Cammack River, albeit a significant proportion of that is culverted. And then more widely, given the current brownfield nature of the site and the existing uses there's issues with surface water management in the area, given the extent of hard standing. So it's an opportunity as the area is regenerated and redeveloped that we could address that through the delivery of more sustainable water management approaches. And then there's a wider issue around the green and blue infrastructure network locally. We've got a series of parks, the likes of the Lansdowne Park and Drumna Castle, as I mentioned previously. And then there's real opportunities there to build on the back of creating biodiversity opportunities within the area. And what we've come up with is kind of 4 spatial components around which, again, will kind of shape the framework of the area. And we've identified them 1 to 4 there. So we've got the Tyman to Phoenix Park Greenway, the Cammack Flood Alleviation Project, the flagship parks and the Grand Canal. I'll just move on to the next slide then, please. So movement, looking at that theme, major challenges here, particularly in terms of public transport. I mean, the area is well serviced radially, east-west, but there are capacities on the rail and indeed on the bus network in peak hours. And if we've identified the requirement for new stops to support the growth in the area. In terms of the street and the movement hierarchy, we're conscious too that the N7 is an important route. It's a road, it's an arterial route into the city centre, and that capacity needs to be managed and protected as well. However, as it's currently kind of operates, it does create a barrier to pedestrian and cycling activity. So how do we address that? So again, I suppose we're looking at a number of emerging proposals here. So we've identified them 1 to 4 there. So we've got the requirement for a western orbital public transport. We've got an inner and an outer, one on the eastern side, one on the western side to improve that orbital movement. The Kylemore Railway interchange there at number 2 on the Cork line, a real opportunity to provide an interchange there. The Naas Road, the N7, to improve the crossings there, particularly for walking and cycling. And then the requirement number 4 there, again, for a new Lewis stop on the red line. Could I have the next slide, please? So in terms of energies and utilities here, I mean, again, there's real challenges here at the moment. I mean, people, again, will be familiar enough with the area. I mean, it's crisscrossed with pylons. We have energy infrastructure like substations, and we've obviously got the CIE works. But again, there's a real opportunity here to fast track the area's move to zero carbon. And there's opportunities around energy in terms of the use of hydrogen and feeding back energy to the grid, opportunities around heat, particularly in terms of district heating and that capturing waste heat from buildings, and then around utilities, and there's requirements there for water and drainage. And in terms of the waste and the circular economy, again, if done a certain way, this area could contribute to the addressing this issue through initiatives around being waste positive and using waste as a commodity. Just move on to the next slide, please. So sustainability, really, I suppose, this is kind of like our last key theme, and indeed this slide could have been the first one, I suppose, at the start of the key themes section. But I mean, there's a real opportunity here to promote the sustainable regeneration of the area. When it's sustainable in the sense of the economic, environmental, and the social nature of that. And what the 700 hectares gives us here is they give us the opportunity to regenerate the area at a scale of development that could be made significantly impactful, and there could be co-benefits here in terms of delivery of infrastructure, in particular synergies between the various projects. And then there's a huge opportunity here associated with the economic development, wealth creation, etc., job creation. So again, building on this kind of green agenda and tying our kind of preferred scenario around that. So I'm just going to move on to the next section of the presentation, which is the big moves, and I referred to these at the start of the presentation. These are the key pieces of infrastructure that are needed to deliver the emerging preferred scenario, and they effectively provide the skeleton or the framework for future change. And what we're really saying here is this is a kind of a long-term proposition. So it's 30 to 50 years of change over a considerable period of time, maybe even longer. And what you see on the slide here is if you like, the overall concept and the location of all 10 pieces of infrastructure. And again, we'd like your views and your input in relation to them. And what I'm going to do now is take you through each of those 10 big moves, if you like, or pieces of infrastructure in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to outline the current situation, the opportunities and the challenges associated with each of those. So go to the next slide, please. So the first one of our 10 big moves is the Western Orbital Public Transport route. And as you can see it there on the slide, there's two proposed. There's an inner and an outer one as well. The current situation is there's no orbital high quality public transport. And again, it results then in anybody wanting to make those movements largely dependent on private cars. But there is an opportunity to develop those two routes as identified on the slide here. And what we're saying here is that the opportunity initially might be to provide bus routes along that, but I mean, future-proofing the design that they may be able to take rail somewhere down the line. And effectively by delivering these two routes, that will create a catalyst for the regeneration of the area, simply providing better connectivity. But obviously there's major challenges around the delivery of that. Just move on to the second big move, please. So this is the Kylemore rail interchange, which I've mentioned previously. So there's real potential here for a heavy rail stop on the Kylemore Road on the Cork line. And obviously there's also an opportunity to integrate there with the Lewis extension to Lucan. So at that location, an opportunity for a significant hub and the creation of an interchange between those two modes and the bus and indeed walking and cycling. And again, an interchange of that scale, you obviously there's a whole opportunity with oversight development there, which the two slides on the right hand side, or the two pictures on the right hand side of the slide demonstrate as well. Major challenges obviously around the coordination and delivery of that. So just move on to big move 3, which is the Naas Road crossing. And again, people will be familiar enough with the current conditions around the Naas Road. It's very hostile to walking and cycling. But again, there's opportunities here, particularly on the back of the Bus Connects project, which is to go for planning consent towards the end of this year. But walking and cycling has been integrated into part of that. The orbital routes that I mentioned there as part of Big Move 1, again, there's an opportunity there to future-proof and design walking and cycling into those couple of routes as well, and more broadly to promote walking and cycling locally there, particularly for local trips. However, there's huge challenges associated with that as well, and I mentioned the importance of the N7 in terms of strategic traffic in the wider Dublin area, and indeed the current issues around capacity. And again, it's not like we're saying that we want to reduce that capacity, but again, we'd like to kind of maybe as I say, create better opportunities for walking and cycling associated with that. But we're not under no illusions about the difficulties of doing that, particularly putting in crossings, because the more crossings you put in, potentially the more you impact on the capacity of the route. So just move on to the next big move, please. Number 4, which is the Naas Road Lewis stop. And again, this is kind of in recognition of the deficit in terms of public transport capacity locally. It's located there, as you can see, on the eastern side of the Naas Road, the eastern side of the study area. And there's potential here at this location. It's one of our hubs that I mentioned earlier on, to create, that both a residential and employment centre there, and an opportunity again to interchange with different modes. It also intersects with the outer orbital route there. However, in terms of challenges, there's again that whole delivery aspect, and again we're mindful of the impact on the N7's capacity. Moving on to the next big move, this is the Timon to Phoenix Park Greenway. Currently, there's no real kind of route of this scale that's safe really to cycle and connect both Timon Park and the Phoenix Park here. The Cork rail line obviously acts as a barrier, but there's a real opportunity there, and if it was delivered, it obviously would be a real a real positive for the area. But again, challenges both in terms of the land take that's needed to deliver that, and then also we'd have to be mindful too about the whole environmental and ecological impacts of delivering a route like that as well. If I could move to the next slide, please. So this is undergrounding the pylons again. Obviously, people will be aware of them. You can see the extent of the network as kind of indicated on the slide there. They're largely viewed as being undesirable urban obstacles. I mean, there's health concerns associated with this type of infrastructure. But for ourselves, I suppose one of the big concerns is the fact of the impact of these existing corridors on the extent of the net developable land. I mean, effectively 10% of the 700 hectares of land is lost as a result of this. So there's an opportunity that if we were to remove the pylons, that we could significantly increase that net developable area of land for development. You'd significantly improve the visual amenity of the area. But then obviously there's challenges around doing that, introducing that change. We want to ensure that there's no impact on supply maintenance. There's challenges around the delivery of projects, of undergrounding projects, and there's obviously cost implications, how much and who pays for it. So I'm going to move on to the next big move. This is the number 7. This is the Cammack flood alleviation. The current conditions there is that the Cammack, large portions of a culvert are culverted. There's flooding issues there locally that have to be dealt with, and actually there's a joint project at the moment undergoing again between South Dublin and Dublin City Council, looking at the flood alleviation and river restoration project associated with the Cammack. So again, the challenge for us in the project is obviously to collaborate and integrate with the position that's taken on that, but that's underway at the moment. In terms of the opportunities, again, deculverating the river, opening up that green lung will greatly assist the whole management of flood risk. There's opportunities then obviously for biodiversity along this new corridor, and obviously improving generally the amenity of the area and facilitating walking and cycling as well. But challenges in terms of land take and indeed this whole issue of kind of like managing the environment and ecological impacts will have to be addressed as part of the delivery. If we could move on to the next big move, number 8 here. This is our flagship parks. So again, our analysis shown is that there's a deficit of open space in the area at the moment. Not surprising given the kind of the employment nature of the location. But there's an opportunity here to create a kind of a flagship park, a destination for people. And obviously tying this in with the Greenway as well. Again, being mindful of the whole green infrastructural approach, there's opportunities there to make the flagship parks multifunctional. Obviously, they'll contribute in terms of surface water management and also improve the biodiversity and ecological value of the area. Challenges, though, exist in terms of land take and again in managing that the environmental impacts associated with the delivery of infrastructure like this. And then number 9, if we could move on to the next slide, that's the Grand Canal. Again, people will be aware of this. There's a great link here from this particular area and from further west into the city centre, into Grand Canal Dock. But again, other than cycling and some walking, as an amenity, it's quite poorly used. So there's an opportunity here maybe to make the Grand Canal itself a destination, and maybe an opportunity to work with the water there, and to improve the amenity of the area. But again, challenges in terms of land take and the delivery of any change in the ground, and obviously have to be conscious of the ecological value of the asset. And then finally, just the last big move, number 10. this is around the whole issue of the energy and heat network. So currently, I mean, we're too dependent on fossil fuel, and we have a network in the area, but it's not integrated. And there's a lot of waste heat generated locally through different businesses, but it's not captured. So again, the opportunity to address that deficit in terms of a network, to shift to renewables, and to capture and use the heat generated locally. But again, there's challenges, and probably the big one here really is getting neighborhood infrastructure of a scale in, getting a site of a size and the technology as such to support change of that scale, and then obviously coordinating the delivery of that infrastructure with other development. So if I just move on to the next slide, please. So that's where we are in terms of program overview at the moment. So effectively, stage one is finished there. That commenced in July 2020. So that's the study, and I mentioned the baseline analysis and et cetera that we've done. So that's informed where we are now at the moment. So that's stage two, strategic framework. So within that, as I say, we've developed a vision and we've developed a preferred scenario. So we're actually in public consultation, engaging at the moment in relation to that. The next stage really, I suppose, is that we kind of get feedback on that. And our intention is that by the end of this year, we'll have we'll develop enough consensus and support in terms of the emerging preferred scenario. And then we'll ask, I suppose, again, for clear steer from different stakeholders on whether we progress to the next stage of the project, which would be plan and project stage, which will happen sometime in 2022. I mentioned at the outset that we got funding for this project under the Urban Regeneration Development Fund. So our funding actually is up until the end of this year. So really, I suppose, based upon the work that we've done to date, a decision will have to be taken on whether or not, from a cost benefit analysis, whether there's consensus around, this is the right approach and that we should continue further. So we really are kind of, as I say, working up towards the end of this year to that decision. So I've just moved to the next slide. So just in terms of next steps, so this is in a little bit more detail here. So as I mentioned, we're on public consultation at the moment. All the comments we get over this 4-week period, we will prepare a report and we'll feed that back into both the elected members in Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council. And we've engaged with our elected members throughout the process as well and briefed them on numerous occasions, so they're fully up to speed with this. So we really want to, again, to ensure that we have that kind of democratic input into the process. We'll be preparing a framework plan, which will basically refine the preferred scenario, and we'll identify as here's the guiding principles. And again, going back to the 10 big moves, the infrastructure that's needed to support that, and the intervention locations where that has to happen. That work is being supported by a movement framework, an economic strategy, and a housing analysis. That's all going to feed into that particular process. Once we have that emerging preferred scenario, we have that kind of fleshed out, if you like, we'll follow up with a series of conversations with state departments and agencies, again, to build up the consensus around whether or not the approach is correct or not, and whether or not there's sufficient merit in progressing forward. And then, as I say, from 2022 onwards, if we get the green light, we'll progress this then to kind of master plan or plan stage. I should, just before I leave this slide, to just mention that all the work that we've done to date has been subject to compliance with the various EU directives in relation to strategic environmental assessment, the Habitats Directive, and strategic flood risk assessment. And actually, reports produced to support the emerging preferred scenario are available on our website as well. So just move to the next slide, please. So the next part of this afternoon's proceedings is the question and answers, and I'm just going to invite in my colleagues into this part of this afternoon. So I just invite in Mick Mulhern, who did the introductions. Mick is Director of Service for Land Use Planning and Transport in South Dublin County Council. I'll also invite in James Phelan, who's the Executive Planner with South Dublin, and James is part of the project team working on this. And then I'll also invite in Kevin Logan. Kevin is a director with McCrainer Lavington. He's an architect and an urban designer. And Kevin is kind of like the lead consultant on this particular project. And I'll also invite in Alan Connolly. Alan is with Sistra, and they've been advising us on the transport and mobility elements of the strategy to date. So I think at this stage, I'll just hand back to Mick. Mick is, I think, going to moderate the questions, and we'll continue with the next part of the afternoon.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. That was very comprehensive. And just to kind of reiterate one point that Brian made very well at the end, which is the stage that we're at now is ultimately about setting that vision for the future of this place and putting in place a framework or a skeleton, if you like, for how this place would come forward over the next 20, 30, 40 years. This is a long-term proposal. So this is and one of the questions that was come up, which I'll come on to in a minute, kind of touched on that neatly, which was raised by both Savills and Brian Meldon have said, what, and I'll come to you on this one, Brian, just to give you a heads up, what is the next stage for this? Is there a statutory plan to be prepared? Will there be a particular type of zoning that emerges as a result of this? How does this framework, which is non-statutory, how does it become a plan? So Brian, you might take that question.
Sure, and no problem. Yeah, that's it's a key issue here. Like as you mentioned, Mick, it's non-statutory at the moment, and a lot of time and energy has gone into getting us to this point as well. But I do think we will be at that crossing point towards the end of this year, where we will, if everything aligns correctly, and if there's a value for money and if there's enough consensus about it, we will move to a statutory plan making stage. So that will follow kind of next year. Again, there's a fair bit of work to be done before we get to that point. And the exact nature of that is kind of open for kind of like, I suppose, debate at the moment. Are we talking a local area plan? Are we talking a strategic development zone? Housing for All is referenced a new planning instrument, an urban development zone. So we could be looking at a version of that. What we're really trying to do is kind of build enough evidence up to support, the requirement for a statutory plan. And then if there's any rezonings needed to support that, obviously, I know both Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council would do variations to the development plan to support that anyway. So I think that's on the cards. I think it's probably, a bit early to say so, but as I say, we're obviously doing this for a reason. So we would anticipate that there would be an opportunity for a statutory plan, somewhere down the line. But we want to get to a point where we're kind of clear in terms of what is the ask around that. We're not just interested in producing a plan that's quite interesting and sits on a shelf. We want to work with all the stakeholders and all the landowners to deliver. And there's real challenges around that. And I suppose that's part of the reason we have Kevin from Recrainer Lavington here and their international experience in terms of urban regeneration and the various kind of, supports that are needed to deliver that. That's the type of thing that we're investigating at the moment as well. And that's something that, we're going to build in as part of this process as well.
Great, thanks. And I just add one, to come back on a comment or a question which you started to touch on there, Brian, about housing for all and potential new legislation. Savills had questions on this. Effectively, I think what that legislation, which as we understand it from reading Housing for All, is about an approach to plan making which effectively recognises the significant challenges of complex brownfield development, where there's multiple landowners and there's big infrastructure needed to be delivered within area where is existing development, which is quite different from it's an evolution of a lot of the SDZs which are currently in place across the country. We have two of them ourselves in South Dublin at Clonburris and Adamstown. But I think what we'll do is we don't quite yet know what that future legislation might look like. And so in that intervening period, as Brian has nicely put it, the intention is that, at the moment as it stands, the intention would be that we would ultimately be developing a statutory plan, potentially a local area plan, which might cross the two boundaries. There's still a bit of work to do on that. I'm going to change now, and I'll bring in. There was a question asked from Jim, which relates to. Are we going to end up CPOing land here to facilitate the delivery of some of these larger parks, as an example? And I think, I can try and answer that in the first instance, and Brian or Kevin might need to come in as well.
Sure.
But ultimately, at the moment, as we've said, what we're trying to do at the moment is put in place a plan for the type of livable city that we want to create. That's the aspiration. At the moment, things like what Brian pointed out, there's a significant deficiency of open space in the area. If we're to try and bring a large new residential and employment population into this place, it's absolutely central to that we create and provide the type of spaces that people will need, and that these are provided in a timely fashion. At the moment, what we're doing is trying to figure out where are the best places to do that. Some of those will be improvements and expansions of existing spaces. Some of those will have to be new. And through this exercise at the moment, and you'll be able to start to see some of this information in some of the slides that Brian showed, but equally some of the stuff on the website. Land will be needed to put, there might be other uses on some of that land at the moment. We would hope to bring those forward as part of development, but in some instances there may well be some land assembly required to facilitate these larger amenity spaces. And Jim, you answered you asked a second question there about what might the impact to some of the businesses be here. And I suppose, Brian, do you want to come in and just maybe expand a little bit about what the impact might be on some of the businesses?
Yeah, I mean, again, what our analysis has shown to date, Mick, is that there's a lot of activity out there. I mentioned the number of jobs, contributions to the economy, etc. So we're very mindful of the fact, that there's existing activity out there. We want to support it, but then there's an opportunity as well. I mean, the nature of employment is changing as well. There are sites there where there may be the potential for the consolidation of activity on portions of the site. There may be opportunities for other parts of the site to be brought forward for redevelopment. Like there may be even opportunities again, and we touched in the presentation there, the hubs, etc. There may be opportunities for clustering of certain uses or activities around those hubs, and that might free up land elsewhere. I suppose what we're also saying as well is that we want a strategy around that as well. It's not just a case that whatever's there has to go. We want to work with those businesses, and we want to provide options. And what we're very keen on doing is coming up with kind of like an understanding of what can be kept and where, and then who might want to relocate or in within the area, and then potentially who might want to relocate out of the area, and again we're going to work with all of that. But I think we're trying to get our handle around the scale of that, but that's also tied in with the areas potentially where development might go first as well. I mean, it's a two-handed thing, so it's a complex issue, but we're very conscious of it as well. And, we are working with various state agencies on this as well. Like even if you mention our governance structure there, we have like representatives from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Like we've got the Land Development Agency on board as well, etc. So like all these conversations are being held, and I think it's important to get those views from the, interested parties, landowners affected by this, so that they inform our thinking at this stage, so as much kind of input we can get on that particular issue would be really, really helpful.
Brian, it kind of segues neatly into another question which has come up. I can't quite say the name of the individual, so apologies there, but you referenced there where development might be taking place first, and this question is about, I suppose there's two or three elements to this question, which is where do we think development will be taking place first, but I suppose maybe if you just wanted to focus on the second part, which is might there be any implications for schemes that have planning permission already? And what might the implicate? I mean, you referenced already our intention to progress through another statutory plan process. What might be the implication for schemes that already have planning permission? Do you want to just maybe focus on that one first?
Well, I mean, effectively, anything with planning permission has planning permission, and this is a non-statutory process, so that's not affected really. I suppose so. I mean, again, whoever owns that land, if they've got planning permissions, there's nothing to stop them developing, under the terms of that permission. That's fine. And indeed, in the city council, the Naas Road LAP lands, that statutory plan is in place up until 2023. So that's not going to be changed on foot of this study. So all that's in place. So I suppose the challenge then really is that, I mean, we know more broadly within Dublin, there's 40,000 planning permissions for homes in the Greater Dublin area, but they're not being built for various reasons, and a lot of that is around finance and viability and all the rest. So what we're saying here again is there's an opportunity for those existing permissions that are out there, and they're of a scale as well. We're talking maybe 3,500 odd units or so, that maybe early phases of that might kind of be part of this process. And as we develop out our plan or a vision for the area, as it goes onto a statutory footing, there might be opportunities for that to change and evolve. So long story short, what I'm saying is we're going to work with the existing permissions that are out there, and hopefully shape the plan around kind of like the future business intentions of those landowners and developers. We'll work with that, but also maybe providing alternatives and opportunities there, from a housing point of view, and then obviously get more housing activity in the area if everything falls into place. We know there's huge demand. There's an issue with housing supply, and what we're saying really more broadly, I suppose, identifying those target figures of 75,000 odd people, maybe 40 odd thousand homes in the area. There's a real opportunity there. But what we're also saying is that it has to be done in a plan-led way, and that's really what we're talking about here today. So it's working with what's there, providing options, but having a view to the future, and again, ultimately, taking advantages of those opportunities to create a more sustainable location, and there's a real opportunity there. Like I mentioned, the energy and the circular economy and all that, that's something that I think will set this place apart. It's not just going to be a version of what's happened before. Really, this whole issue of kind of like our move to zero carbon, etc., is kind of at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here. So it's pretty radical. There's a lot of information on the documentation in line, and I encourage people to kind of to read that at their leisure, but really what we're saying here, that if it's going to be meaningful, if it's going to be proper sustainable development, it's probably going to be a fairly radical shift in terms of how we look at place and how we deliver housing and homes and jobs and amenities in locations like this.
Great, thanks, Brian. And there was a second part in that question about where do we think development will take place first? And I suppose in answer to that one, we do know that there are already 4,000 homes have planning permission in the area, largely around the kind of coming out of Inchicore down the Long Mile Road or the Naas Road. There's a significant amount of and there's a couple of schemes emerging around the Walkinstown area. Part of the exercise about what we're doing now is understanding that and thinking about making sure that those schemes fit in with the future framework, and equally recognizing that a lot of those schemes may not come forward for whatever reason, and that ultimately really what's needed to build confidence in this area, build confidence both for people who want to live here, build confidence for the local authorities and councillors, build confidence for existing communities, build confidence for the landowners and investors, that there is a clear plan, that all of those things that are needed, like your parks and your new street network and your public transport and your social infrastructure, that there's a clear plan in place to deliver them. Because I think without that very clear plan, like good placemaking plan, but also routes to delivery, I don't think you build that confidence for anybody. Yeah. And so ultimately, that's a central tenet of this plan, is about building that confidence, being clear about what we need, when we need it, and getting that support from across all of those state agencies to crack on and get them delivered. I'm just going to change tack a little bit. There's a couple of questions coming in around transport, and Alan, I might bring you in on some of these. There was a very short and succinct one about whatever happened to Metro North. So could you...
Yeah, my understanding is that Metro North, I suppose, became very similar to Metro Link, but the query might be related to Metro West, which formed part of Transport 21. Transport 21 was superseded by the NTA's GDA transport strategy between 2016 and 2035. And now at the minute, the NTA are reviewing that strategy up to 2042. So Metro West didn't form part of the previous GDA transport strategy, which is, I suppose, the backbones for the wider strategic transport of the Greater Dublin area. So generally respond to that. Now, as you're aware, Mick, we're working with the NTA, and they're aware of what we're doing here, in terms of our plans and what we'd like to see, and how that may, help inform the future GDA transport strategy. So we are coordinating on that side of things. I see there's another question in there and relating to transport, and it was to do with the use of ducting along the Railway Procurement Agency's corridors. It is something that's done quite regularly. It's done both on rail corridors, road corridors. TII would do it quite frequently. ESB, in fact, do fibre wraps along their overhead lines, and local authorities, including South Dublin and O'Leary at Down County Council, do it in their local roads. So that is something that kind of took hold and is quite common in the delivery of infrastructure.
Great, thanks very much, Alan. I think the next question, there's a couple of kind of related points here, and just to try to tease them out, it's a housing question, and obviously that's an incredibly important piece of this. The first one I'll pass to you, Kevin, and I'll come to you then, Brian, on a follow-up. But Kevin, in terms of housing, what type of densities and what type of style or typology are we kind of talking about here to get to those numbers that Brian referred to earlier, 70 to 80,000 people living here? what does it look like in terms of density, etc.? Could you kind of just explain a little bit about
that? Certainly, Mick. Yeah, what we're advocating here is a sort of a medium rise, mid-density kind of European form of urbanism. So we're looking at urban blocks, kind of courtyard typologies, with a mix of potential townhouses at lower levels and apartments at upper levels. We don't see there need to be a reliance on tall buildings. We think there is scope for taller elements, but there's not a reliance on tall buildings to deliver the density. And looking at the scale of the lands over a longer period of time, it allows us to do a better planned kind of set of urban environments where we don't need to rely on extremely tall kind of typologies. We're also looking at integrating mix of uses within those in ground floor conditions to deliver the resources and the infrastructure to make truly livable local kind of neighbourhoods as part of that as well.
Great, thanks. And Kevin, would you point to an example or two that you would use as a bit of a precedent for the type of residential urban form that we're trying to kind of get to, or would see as a good example? Would you point to one?
Well, some of the examples that we're looking at are sort of large urban regeneration schemes across in a European context. So we've been collectively looking at areas like King's Cross in London. We've also looked at things like Haven City in Hamburg, and we've been following closely, and part of the team has got contacts back into some of the urban extension schemes going on in Denmark. Particularly around the south of kind of Copenhagen or the North Harbour area, where there's a kind of a relationship between employment, residential growth, and the delivery of supporting infrastructure.
Great, and I'll just take this chance actually just to say we have a number of the people who are involved in those projects from across London and Rotterdam and Copenhagen and Amsterdam actually speaking. We have an international conference event on the 29th and the 30th of September where we have people who have worked on those projects, and many of those have been delivered over the last 20, 30 years, and there's a huge amount of lessons to be learned. And at those two conference events, we'll be talking about the challenges around delivering on brownfield land like this, and the challenge of creating good places to live. So they're on the 29th and the 30th. They're in the morning at 9 to 10:30 on both mornings. We've got the Minister for Housing opening on the first morning as well. So you can go onto our website at cityedge.ie, register and attend and listen into those discussions and ask questions as well. Now, coming back to the questions, Councillor Bailey asked, international investment is obviously a topical issue at the moment, and how do we ensure that we create a housing choice and a housing mix that's open for everybody and not just focused at a very niche piece? And I think I'll start, but Brian, I might bring you in, and Brian, you might talk about the importance of choice in creating mixed and balanced communities from a housing perspective.
Yeah.
But I think on the first point about international investment, I think ultimately what we are trying to do is to recognize that of those 4,000 homes that currently have permission, a sizable number of those currently are 1 and 2 beds, and a lot of PRS. And actually what we do need to do is not correct those, but ultimately going forward, we need to have a much stronger mix, and we need to have a much better balance across the full spectrum of housing choice. And so some of the work that the team are starting to look at, which Brian can talk about quickly, is how we determine what is a healthy mix and a healthy balance. But Brian, is there anything that you want to add to there?
I mean, that you kind of alluded to there, that the piece of work that we're doing a housing kind of study to support our thinking around those very issues, like, kind of what creates kind of like a good, like a community kind of like, and I'm looking at that issue from, I suppose, the housing side of things, like a mix of tenure and topologies, etc. Like, and kind of maybe touch on what Kevin says there. Like, it's not about, it's not all about building height or building form. It's as much about what makes a place work. And I go back to the whole issue there of best practice international examples. Like, that's what we're drawing upon. So we're trying to get a sense of like what can happen and when and what needs to happen. So that's part of the challenge of this, and the interesting part of it too, I should say, of this particular project. And obviously we work with government policy as well. I mentioned housing for all. Like there's certainly a shift towards the whole concept of delivering like affordable housing, and then we also have the land development agency, their particular role as well. So we're going to be working with the policy, we're going to be working with various agencies to address that whole issue of housing. But I mean, I think it's fair to say, we're looking for a mix. We're looking for areas where you'll have a mix of public, private, and rental or whatever. But again, the detail of that has to be worked through.
Great, thanks, Brian. Another and divergent question from the very important topic of housing is that cultural offer, and this is from Sunil Sharp, I think the question really relates. Great talking about residential. We all talk about mixed-use development, but places and cities are born on the spaces in between that, and the cultural offerings and life that goes on around those. Two important things, but life includes all those other pieces. How are we thinking about the provision of, how will a cultural offer form part of this? I'll kick off that piece, and I might bring Kevin in as well. But at the moment, Sunil, we're at quite a high level in terms of a skeleton of the big moves, as we call them, the big offers around housing and employment. Trying to put that skeleton in place, which will always be there, and all of that other pieces, that the meat of the city that sits around that needs to follow, and we need to retain flexibility over time. But I know one of the pieces that we have been looking at is anchors, like bringing in uses which are not employment or residential, but they're that other piece that attracts people. But Kevin, I know the team have been looking at anchors as we're kind of using that term to describe those other uses that can come in and bring people to a place. But do you want to talk a little bit about that work that we've been doing?
Certainly, Mick. Yeah. So we've been looking at what those kind of key kind of other uses could be, and how they could contribute to kind of the wider kind of makeup of the city's resources. And when we talk about the city, we talk about in a sort of a greater Dublin sense. And we're not tied to any of those. We're just looking at what the kind of the implications or what the positive attributes of bringing certain uses in, be that kind of a major cultural use in forms of a venue or a theatre, for instance, be that kind of sporting activity. And what we're looking at is making sure there's the opportunity to accommodate these. We're not going to design the framework based on any particular one, because we know that then that way the framework might be vulnerable if that changes. So it's very much about an opportunity to kind of contribute to the kind of the wider vitality of the area, and those anchors, those major uses, would operate beyond these lands, and they would have an attraction to kind of the greater Dublin population.
Yeah. I think to add to that, Kevin, I think one of the pieces that we've been trying to get across through this work is there'll be a range of analysis around how anchors in that term, that's what we're calling it, but it kind of gets to the point you're making, Sunil, which is we'll be showing the benefits of those, how we might be able to accommodate them over time. But ultimately what we're trying to do is change people's mindset about if there is a large new music venue, or if there is a large something else, or if there is a variety of different types of uses like a university or something. What we want to do is to show people that actually Naas Road is a place that this Naas Road City Edge area is a place where they should be putting on their list to think about. So if there is a university, they should be thinking, actually, maybe this area is the place that I now want to look at and consider more, because we know it's feasible for us to move into that part of the city. So it's very early days, but absolutely attracting that variety of uses, incredibly important. There's a question here about the Cammock and what are we proposing around deculverting it? How will it be funded and how will it be delivered? I'll deal with the funding piece first, but I'll bring Brian in to talk about what's actually being proposed. But ultimately, look, there is a piece of work being assessed by the OPW, Dublin City Council and South Dublin County Council at the moment about the wider Cammock, the wider significant flooding issues that the Cammock presents for the entire city. And there's a piece of work being done there, and we've been engaging with that team to figure out how this part of the Cammock catchment should support the wider flooding issues? Like, how do we need to deal with the CAMHOC within the Naas Road area to support the wider flood alleviation scheme that's being looked at? How it's funded, far too early to kind of give any views on that. But Brian, in terms of that issue around flooding within the Naas Road area, do you want to just talk a little bit about, how much of a real issue that is?
Yeah, I think like, I mean, again, we're very conscious of it. I mean, I kind of touched upon the existing character out there, like, and there is significant deficits out there in terms of infrastructure. And I suppose, again, it's part of the city that was developed in kind of like the late 60s and 70s. And historically, it's reliant on kind of like, an old drainage network, which is combined. So basically means foul and surface water basically end up in the same system. So, obviously what we're saying here is that, we need more kind of progressive engineering solutions, and the opportunity to regenerate the area provides for that. So it's not a case of putting it like, grey engineering solutions. It's really kind of looking at the opportunities afforded by the provision of, new landmark parks, and obviously working with the project that's looking at the restoration of the CAMHOC and the flood alleviation associated with that, to encourage the greater use of more sustainable engineering solutions like around swales and suds, etc. So that's kind of ongoing at the moment. And I suppose what we're saying too, as part of the wider sustainability agenda as well, is that could be kind of like a key element or a key strand of that as well. So quite simply, any surface water that's generated locally has to be managed and accommodated locally effectively. So you're not relying on overloading an existing kind of strain system, But again, it's looking more at a greener solution, if you like, to that particular issue. And again, I suppose more broadly with looking at the wider kind of climate action agenda as well, like instances of flood risk are only going to increase. So we're obviously looking at future-proofing solutions for this area. So there's going to have to be a greater contribution in locations around like this. And then part of that solution is looking at, using our open spaces in our parks and our those types of amenities there multifunctionally to contribute to that.
Okay, great. There's a question here seeking clarification, looking for more detail, trying to get more detail about what heights are appropriate. And I think at the moment, all we can say, is it some, like, and I think the question goes on to say, look, is it comparable to the Royal Liver building that already has planning permission? I mean, ultimately at this stage, we can't say. We're operating at a level above that, trying to figure out those kind of big structural moves that need to take place as part of the next stage of work. And because at the moment, we're just focusing on that, trying to get that right. And as part of the next stage of work that we'll be moving into will be that slightly more detailed analysis at a kind of a neighborhood level. Planning applications will always come forward and have to be determined on a site-by-site basis relative to their context, relative to what's been permitted in the surrounding area, where are they within the overall piece. So it's very hard for us to say. It's not going to be a situation where we're saying everything in this area can be 10 stories and above, or 4 stories or 6 stories. Like, that won't be the space that we'll be operating in. It will be looking to say buildings of a denser, taller nature will be appropriate in this character area, but we won't be at this stage of the plan. We may be through the statutory plan, which will follow next year, but at this stage of the plan, we won't be saying, all along this street it's 7 and 8 stories. Like, that's not the level of detail that we'll be at yet. We're at a step before that, but in time we will get to that point. But in due course, that's not to say the planning applications won't come in, because we know that they will, and they'll be assessed and considered in line with existing policies and the emerging work that we're doing now. Kevin, I'll bring you back in here on a question related to tall buildings from Councillor O'Brien, which says, some developers will argue that they need tall buildings and short buildings to address, so yes, a principle of a medium height thing can be good, but in some instances, variety can be good, or maybe it can't be. And some developers will simply argue, well, I'll do slightly taller, but I'll do taller, but I'll do smaller as well. I mean, how do you manage that? How do you take account of the fact that there might well need to be some tall buildings, or some developers will argue that you need tall buildings? How do you deal with that? And maybe, Brian, from a planning application perspective, you might also practically talk about, how do you assess that as a DM planner, if you like. But Kevin, do you want to go first on that?
Certainly, Mick. Yeah, I mean, just building on what you were just saying, we're obviously operating at the moment in a slight degree of abstraction. But coming back to my point earlier, what we're looking at is the predominant heights in any kind of character area And one of the things that we're looking at is principal street typologies. So you've got something like the N7 and the Naas Road, where you've got a kind of a wider, more arterial corridor. So we can actually have a kind of a wider offset from building to building, so we can look at a kind of a higher principal kind of height along that route. By virtue of having a larger areas to plan and not looking at it on a site-by-site basis, as you said, any site that comes forward individually needs to kind of resolve itself within itself. We can actually start to look at the distribution of uses, intensity at a much more localized level across a number of sites. So you're not reliant on having to resolve all of the issues on one site. We can actually look at the height, the scale, the massing in a much more balanced way across a number of plots in a character area.
Great, thanks. And Brian, from your perspective, if planning applications come in and land on somebody's desk, how do you deal with that position of somebody saying, well, I need a tall building to deal with the daylight sunlight issue, but I'll go a bit shorter somewhere else? I mean, what typically happens in that scenario for the planning officer or the team?
Yeah, well, it would depend, like, I suppose on the policy and the guidance in place at the moment. But I mean, for example, if you were, again, if you have a local area plan in place, you probably have more detailed kind of guidance there in terms of height, etc. So I mean, it's very hard to generalize, but in reality, like, we want a kind of a more urbanized, development of this at a location like what in the the Naas Road or whatever, the City Edge project, what we're talking about here. But as you alluded to, Mick, it'd be kind of policy guidance and the receiving environment, like the context, what's beside it, etc. And I suppose the onus really is on the applicant to demonstrate compliance with all those kind of requirements. But I think the important issue about what we're talking about here is that I think the strategic housing development probably shouldn't really go there, but to mention that in passing is, like, obviously has probably kind of shaped a lot of people's views around urban development and the challenges around that. That was a particular policy instrument that was introduced to deal, to come up with a solution. It probably had unintended consequences, particularly in terms of the types of topologies that it delivered. But really what we're saying is, and I think this is a broader shift within the Irish planning system as well, we're moving more to a plan-led solution. So the type of thing that Kevin was alluding to there is that we take an area-based rather than a site-based response. So we would have an understanding in terms of the appropriate heights and uses and activities on an area-based to create a character, rather than the situation that we currently have at the moment in many locations, where basically you go into the site and the market being what the market, and that's fine. It's about maximizing the return on that without worrying too much about the long-term wider kind of either urban design kind of considerations or maybe the more kind of long-term kind of requirements around housing and sustainability. I mean, again, I go back to the housing and the economic analysis that we're doing as part of this. We're trying to get our heads around what makes a place, and obviously there will be opportunities for sites of scale within what we're talking about here. But it really is more about the wider area, and how we can create neighborhoods where people will want to live, where you have the whole life cycle of etc., and then opportunities to work beside that as well.
Great, thanks, Brian. I think the point that I take from all that is really height whilst an important consideration, does sometimes tend to dominate the discussion around placemaking. And actually there's so much else that needs to go into placemaking which is almost more important, like public transport, the right provision of community spaces, like how does the street work when I'm down there? Is it a pleasant environment to be in? Are there the right mix of uses here? Have we dealt with issues like flooding? Like, they are the issues that we're grappling with right now. Height, whilst important, is a piece that does need to follow when we're at that next level of detail. So I might close that piece down, because there's another angle here which has come up, which is, and it brings us back, Brian, to that conversation about flooding. And whilst we don't have our kind of environmental flood people on here, I think these are valid questions. But have we taken account of the fact that the sea level may well rise significantly over the next 50 years, and flooding is going to get worse and worse and worse? In terms of our analysis, how have we taken account of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned, again, you've kind of alluded to we're at a level, kind of a fairly conceptual level. But what we have done is we have undertaken a strategic flood risk assessment as part of the work that we've done to date, and in that we kind of outlined the measures and considerations that we will be dealing with as we work through the process. But obviously, it's not until we get to the next stage of the plan making exercise, where we kind of get to the master plan on the more detailed level, that we'll work through the detail of that. We're not really in a position to kind of address all the issues like in their entirety, so to speak. But we are very, very conscious of that. And I think, in fairness, one of the strengths of the Irish planning system is the whole issue of flood risk, and the fact that it is kind of now built in its part. It's one of the key assessments that informs any plan, and indeed any development application as well. It's something that has to be addressed along with habitats as well. And environmental assessment.
On the flooding, I think it's very fair to say that the strategic flood risk assessment work that we've done to date, very conscious of potential future flooding,
completely,
the issues around the Camach, etc., and our that visioning piece that we've done to date tries to recognize that big challenge and almost turn it into an opportunity, whereby we're identifying land that might well be needed or might well flood in the future, and actually thinking about how that land could be used to provide other things like parks or etc., or drainage. So look, I'm conscious that we're coming right to the end of the time. We've covered a lot of the questions that have been asked. Apologies if we've missed any. I think there's an opportunity, there's a minute or two left, but what I'll just say is, as we said throughout this, this is one of two detailed presentations and Q&A. The next one is on the evening of Thursday the 30th. But in addition to that, we've also got two what we're calling international conferences. One on the morning of the 29th at 9 a.m. and one on the morning of the 30th at 9 a.m. And on the 29th, we're focusing on the challenges around delivering development, delivering infrastructure, aligning state agencies, aligning the private sector, landowners to get things built on brownfield land. And the second, of which a lot of questions I think have come out today on, is how do you do placemaking well? How do you create good density and good places and take account of all of the challenges that we're going to face? So we've got a raft of, we've got 5 or 6 really interesting speakers from across the UK and Europe to talk about their experiences. So go on to cityedge.ie, register. You'll be sent a link just as you have been for this, and you'll be able to sit in and listen to that discussions and answer questions as well. So I don't think.
Come in there, Mick, as well, just to remind people as well that we're asking people to make submissions on this concept plan, and people have until midnight on the 6th of October, and those submissions will be summarised more or less in a report that will go to the council meetings in both in Central County Council and in Dublin City Council at the beginning of November. And those reports themselves and the submissions will be considered and will feed into the framework plan, which will be another level of detail on top of these conceptual plans. So just to let everybody know as well that this is very much a conceptual plan, and this is why we're going out on consultation now, so everybody gets to have their say before we progress any further to something that's a little more detailed.
Great, thanks very much, James. I'm just looking to our team here to ask, is there any more questions that? No, we don't. Okay, well, I think at that point we're 2 minutes over. So I just want to take this chance to thank everybody for taking the time to look. And as James said, further questions or comments through the cityedge.ie website, which will bring you to our portal to submit comments. But thank you, everybody, and we'll bring it to a close now.